this is not only about Greenland. This is about a bigger change in the approach to being in the world as a great power that we are seeing coming out of the of Washington D.C. And therefore, also very early on, already last year, one response we had from the Inuit Circumpolar Council was to clearly state that there's no such thing as a better colonizer.
Good evening and welcome to Cambridge Forum. I'm Jennifer Moore, your guest moderator, and I'm delighted to guide our conversation, Skating on Thin Ice, the geopolitics of Greenland and the Arctic. We know the Arctic is warming at an unprecedented rate, but as we begin 2026, the heat isn't just environmental, it's also geopolitical. We're just coming off a month of extraordinary diplomatic tension regarding Greenland's status within the Atlantic Alliance, and now the world is recalibrating. Many tend to imagine the Arctic as a remote expanse of ice, yet it is in fact a region defined by the Arctic Circle and bordered by 8 nations: the United States, Canada, Denmark via Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Nearly 4 million people live across this circumpolar world, and this includes more than 30 indigenous peoples whose homelands long predate modern borders. And those communities, along with the 5 coastal states that directly ring the Arctic Ocean, are now having to navigate a rapidly changing environment. Melting ice is redrawing shipping routes, exposing new resources, and reshaping the balance of power. So, to explore all of this with us, we're joined by 3 experts who are at the front lines of this shift. I'm glad to welcome them. We have Kenneth R. Rosen. Kenneth is an award-winning journalist and author of Polar War. He spent 3 years reporting across the Arctic, embedding with military units and documenting how climate change is reshaping security in the high north. Heather A. Conley is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a leading expert on transatlantic security. She previously led the German Marshall Fund and has advised policymakers on Arctic governance for decades. And Sarah Olsvig, who joins us from Norway right now, is the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, representing Inuit across Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Chukotka. A former parliamentarian in both Greenland and Denmark, Sarah is a prominent advocate for Indigenous rights and Arctic self-determination. Thank you all for being with us for this timely conversation. We have a packed audience this evening, hungry to learn, so let's dive in. Kenneth, we're going to start with you. We want to hear what you've been seeing on the ground. You, for the last year or so and beyond, have been watching the Arctic transform in real time, environmentally, militarily, politically. Tell us what you've seen on the ground that explains why Greenland has shifted now from being seen as a scientific frontier to now such a strategic priority for the Pentagon.
Sure, Jennifer, and thanks for having me this evening. I'm a bit flummoxed by the rhetoric coming out of DC, specifically about Greenland, because there's so much more going on in the Arctic than just what Greenland has to offer, and I think it's more of a product of this new hemispheric approach to national security that dictates what the desires for Greenland are. But broadly speaking, most of the communities and peoples I met with during my travels were oftentimes focused on simply surviving. The region is changing so drastically because of climate change and because of this outside interest that many communities are pulled in 2 different directions, right? Like self-subsistence and self-awareness and self-longevity, as opposed to protection against the states that ostensibly offer them security. So there's just this real confusion about what their future looks like and how best to manage it when they've been ignored for so long, and now all of a sudden the spotlight seems on them.
You mentioned climate change there. You have uncovered how climate change is really changing geopolitics. Can you tell us a little bit how environmental changes that you've witnessed in the Arctic are really paving new way for conflict in some ways?
Well, the book really sought to question what does climate change mean for the rest of us, those of us who live in mid-latitude states or mid-latitude parts of the world, and why we should care about a place that is warming 3 to 4 to 5 times faster than the rest of the globe. And what we've seen are countries appreciating how that climate change is impacting them very far away, how typhoons are being created where there were no typhoons before. We see Turkey, India, China all taking these near Arctic interests in the region to sort of stake a claim to what has become a more open and more accessible region. And of course, the US isn't alone in desiring some form of presence there more than it has in the past.
Okay, and back to the bold rhetoric we've heard in the past month or so. In your reporting on the ground, you have described the U.S. as dangerously unprepared for the high north. So I want you to help us look purely at basically the hardware, the icebreakers, the deep water ports, the personnel. Does the U.S. actually have the capacity to back up this bold rhetoric?
Not only does it not have the actual hardware to back it up, but it also doesn't have a willing personnel backlog or personnel infrastructure set of military units who are capable in the north and also, frankly, willing to spend their time in the north. When I was reporting the book, the U.S. had 3 icebreakers. One was often cannibalized for parts. Another was dedicated to the Arctic, and one was dedicated to Antarctica. And since the book has come out, or I finished writing it, the U.S. has purchased another icebreaker. But what's really interesting is that the U.S. Coast Guard simply doesn't have the recruitment or retainment to fully staff vessels. I remember I was traveling with a security cutter, not a polar security cutter, just a run-of-the-mill security cutter in the Bering Sea. And it was the only vessel patrolling that large swath of land on the international date line on the shared border with Russia, maritime border with Russia and China. So there's a sense of being stretched thin in this region, but also simply not able to force projection and project our forces in the north. And so it was really disheartening to see more of the European countries taking a serious role in their Arctic territories, whereas the U.S. has been lagging and I arguably still continues to lag.
Okay, and Kenneth, you mentioned China. China is not traditionally something that a country that a lot of people would associate with the Arctic, and yet it labels itself as a near Arctic state. Help us understand that a little bit better. China's presence on the ground in the Arctic, is it a hard military posture or more of a quieter economic form of influence?
Yeah, there's no hard military posture. There's no troops or equipment on the ground in that aspect, but there are a lot of research stations dotted throughout, Chinese research stations dotted throughout the Arctic. You have one in New Allison, which is on Svalbard. You have one in Iceland, and they also tried to fund the airport expansion in Nuuk, as well as a mining contract that fell through. So you see this financial coercion that we've known China is, willing to enact on nations in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, as well as it wanting to open up what it's calling the Polar Silk Road along the northern coast of Russia. So there is more of an economic interest that we're seeing from China, but there's also the pragmatic approach of saying, climate change affects us too, and we want a place at the table to, determine our future in that respect.
Okay, thank you. I want you to hold that thought on the Polar Silk Road. We'll get back to that in a little bit. But Heather, help us widen the lens. In the past 30 days, the U.S. focus on Greenland has caused some real diplomatic turbulence. It has strained relations with Denmark, and it has prompted some pretty serious conversations among NATO allies about trust, influence, and really the future of the Arctic. So one thing I've heard from a few people in my circle as a journalist is at the, under the 1951 Defense Agreement, the U.S. already has broad access to Greenland. So why is there a sudden pressure now for these new arrangements? Is there something in the existing framework that old system just can't handle anymore?
Well, Jennifer, great to be with you. Great to be with Sarah and Ken. It's a great question. I wish I had a great answer for you because really the United States has everything it needs within the 1951 bilateral U.S. Kingdom of Denmark defense agreement, which has been updated and modernized in 2004. I think it just to just go back in history for a moment. First, there was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, of which the Kingdom of Denmark, Greenland was a founding part of that. And then 2 years later, we created this bilateral mechanism to basically strengthen America's security posture. And certainly during the Cold War, we had upwards of 10,000 U.S. forces on Greenland, numerous military installations. It is strategically located, certainly to protect the vital sea lanes of communication in the North Atlantic. It's very important for America's missile defense and early warning line, but we've always done that in partnership with the Kingdom of Denmark. But as Ken was saying, what the White House is talking about is something very different, which is why they chose not to go through, if they wanted more military installations, if they wanted additional radar stations, that was a dialogue that could have been had under the 1951 agreement. But this, the president has been very clear, this was about ownership, purchase, acquisition. And it was very clear from our Danish and Greenlandic friends that this was not possible. And we just kept insisting on it until, to your point, I think something just broke on January 20th before the Davos speech. And, the cost of that repair and to rebuild that broken trust is going to take a very long time.
And so that leads me to my next question. So the Davos framework was signed to try to lower the temperature between Washington and its European allies. So do you think that this is just a temporary awkward phase in the alliance, or are we seeing a deeper structural crack in this longstanding relationship?
Well, I think the transatlantic relationship changed over Greenland. I think we still have to understand that. I think we're very grateful that the administration and the president particularly has chosen for now an off-ramp. I mean, it was offered almost 3 weeks before when the Danish and Greenlandic foreign ministers sat down with Vice President Vance and Secretary Rubio, and they created a high-level working group to have this conversation. And then the next day, the White House went back to its "we will be acquiring Greenland," and which is where the crisis, arrived. So now it is back into a framework. Technical talks were held this past week. There's been scheduled for more. Maybe Sarah can help us understand a little bit more. But again, we could have done this a year ago. The door was open for us to do more militarily, more economically. But now, I think as the United States proposes some of those things, they're going to be looked at with great suspicion because many are concerned that the White House's true aim for acquisition hasn't ended. So again, that deep, deep distrust is something that we're going to have to work through.
Okay, and I know we're jumping around the world quite a bit here, but I just want to get a landscape for those of us who are just getting up to speed on Greenland. So what I want to bring in a little bit, Heather, is two countries who are often overlooked on the Arctic, and that is Russia and China. As we talked about earlier, China has the vision for the so-called Polar Silk Road, new Arctic routes, development corridors, but that vision of China's depends heavily on Russia making room. How does this partnership between Moscow and Beijing change the security picture in the North Atlantic?
Well, right. Well, certainly we saw, I would say 5 to 7 years ago, China was trying to make inroads into Canada, as Ken mentioned, even Greenland, across the Nordic space. And they were met with suspicion, lack of transparency. And then two things happened, of course. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and 2-3 weeks before that full-scale invasion, the announcement by Beijing and Moscow of this unlimited partnership. And so then China began to really, again, for China to achieve full access across the Arctic, either Russia has to allow it to have greater access through the maritime route, the Northern Sea route, or it has to happen through the NATO allies and partners. And so this partnership, but I want to reinforce, there's total difference in prioritization. For Russia, 51% of the Arctic coastline, the Arctic is their future, their economic future with oil and gas production, their security future, because within the Arctic, their strategic nuclear submarine fleet is housed. It's incredibly important to them. For China, the Arctic is important, but as a source of diversification for maritime routes, for energy resources, for critical minerals, for fisheries. It will always be selective in how it wants to proceed in the Arctic. Russia needs a lot of investment, which was taken away because of the full-scale invasion and the loss of U.S. companies and energy service providers. They've all left. So Russia's becoming more dependent on China's role in helping to develop the Russian Arctic. At the same time, Russia grows increasingly concerned about China's greater footprint in the Russian Arctic. So it's a strange combination. But make no mistake, the Arctic is incredibly important to Russia. It is a superpower in the Arctic. China will continue just to see slow, incremental maritime, economic, and scientific presence across the Arctic.
Okay, and back to the geopolitical instability the tension we're seeing between the United States and its NATO allies. Do you think that Russia and China have just been laying low, watching, or are they actively looking for a way to perhaps capitalize on this internal friction within NATO?
Well, I mean, certainly they're looking and seeing the growing tensions between the United States and their closest allies with a smile on their face, because America's one great unfair international advantage is this incredible global network of allies. And that is something that Russia and China do not have at all. So increased tensions for them, that suits them, the isolation of the United States, the isolation of our allies. In fact, certainly the Russians have been understanding, they say, of President Trump's position for Greenland. It gets back to, if we go to an era of spheres of influence where strong countries have the rights over smaller countries in their regions. Russia would make this argument about Ukraine. This suits them. So they were very pleased. They're not going to stand in our way as we're, eroding our own great global advantage.
Thank you. Sarah, I'd like to move on to you. Again, I know it's late there in Norway. We really appreciate you being with us. You bring a unique perspective to this discussion tonight. You, as well as anyone, know Greenland is not an empty frontier. It is a homeland, and it is a political community with its own voice, its own agency. I can only imagine what a few weeks it's been for Greenlanders. First of all, just tell us how are Greenlanders responding to being spoken about and sometimes spoken for on the world stage, like we've seen in the past month.
And first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to this event. It's good to have an opportunity to have a direct voice in these things that are so deeply about us in the Arctic and in Galashiq Nunaat, Greenland. I think that there's been many different responses from Galashiq. I think, first of all, it's important to establish that the people of Greenland is a people pursuant to international law with the right of self-determination, recognized both through the Self-Government Act of 2009, but also as established through the institutional and legal regimes that we know and that has been built over decades through the international system. And I think what many of us at a very early stage realized in the second round or third round of interest from the US, because we have to remember in 2019, there was also the idea of purchasing Galashiq Nunaat, Greenland, which was responded by the government, open for business, not for sale. But this second and third round that came last year and this year has made it very clear, and I think many Galashiq Greenlanders, we see through that this is not only about Greenland. This is about a bigger change in the approach to being in the world as a great power that we are seeing coming out of the of Washington D.C. And therefore, also very early on, already last year, one response we had from the Inuit Circumpolar Council was to clearly state that there's no such thing as a better colonizer. And I think that, when you talk about the Arctic as if it is a scientific frontier or a last frontier or an ice desert, that's exactly also, reflecting that notion that those coming outside of the Arctic think that the Arctic is somewhere that you can just go and grab, just go and collect data, just go and map and then report back, and then you suddenly have some kind of power over the land. Those are things that are deeply recognizable to us who have already been colonized once. And therefore, we very clearly can see when the connotations or the thinking behind the approach to talking about us has has that approach in it. So I think that especially in this time around this year in 2026 in January, we've seen a change in the way that people respond. We've seen that the big protest, which once again was a record number of people, going out on the streets in Nuuk, and I was there with my family as well, did so with the headline of calling and demanding respect for our right of self-determination and also upholding international law. But back to us also, and people generally in Galashiland realizing that this is not only about us. The big question is, of course, how is this rupture, as Prime Minister Carney from Canada has called it, or the change in the world order that we are facing, and we are now frontline in terms of watching right before our very eyes in Galashiland. How is that going to affect the relationship between peoples unequal in number, peoples unequal in military power? And that's really what we are back to. And I think that that's the change we're seeing also now, coming from the European allies within the NATO alliance, based on also what Heather Conley said, realizing from their side as well that rupture and that change is deeper than we might have thought or we might have been willing to face. And therefore, it's been very, very clear over the past month that the statements of support for Galashiland have been very clear from states, but also from other indigenous peoples all over the world. And therefore, also, we've seen how the sort of the talk about what's going on has turned to a much more serious level, and a level that is a global, where it takes it into a global perspective, which we have also seen from a very early stage, I would say, from Galashiland, Greenland.
I want to ask you about that a little bit more. So you mentioned the international law, the international framework. It seems that there is a kind of a strange dual track situation right now. On one hand, you do have this international scaffolding that really cements Greenland's status. And on the other hand, you have this unpredictable rhetoric we've been hearing, whether it's through a social media post or a press conference in DC, that can change the political mood in an hour. How does that volatility affect Greenland's ability to plan?
Well, on an international scale, we've seen a change in the political mood since January 20th. We've seen how states have stood up, lined up to support the right of self-determination of the people of Greenland. And I think that's also a change in mood. So I think those, the things that affect each other from the communication that comes out, are quite massive in these days, these very hours and days. I'm here at the Arctic Frontiers in Tromsø, Norway, one of the big Arctic conferences. And even here, we are also seeing the few people from the government of Galashiland and the few people that are here who are from our nation, Galashiland, are, being approached time and time again from partners from all over the world, wanting to express that solidarity and that support. So So yes, there's been a tendency also since 2019 with the idea of purchasing Geopolitics Greenland. Things were, very much on social media. We've seen it also in 2024 and 25 and now in 26, this happening. But social media also creates a platform for Geopolitics and Greenland to really display our side of the story. And we've seen also that wave of support coming in Davos from numerous states in statements and actions by the European allies within the NATO alliance, and also from peoples and others from all over the world, women's organizations and all kinds of institutions and organizations have very clearly and formally stated their support. EU, for example, also. So that's also a change that we are taking note of, that states that would previously maybe be a little bit more diffuse in how they would address the fact that the people of Geopolitics is a people pursuant to international law with the right of self-determination, are now very, very clear on that. And I think that really also has, underscored the change that we've seen throughout January, where states have also had a need to position themselves in terms of, what we've heard as a rupture. Where do they stand on that side? Those sides of the rupture, and those that stand with Geopolitics stand for a certain set of values that they share.
And a quick follow-up. So Greenland has been very clear. It's open to trade and to development, but on its own terms. And so tell us, what does a mutually beneficial economic partnership with the United States look like from your perspective? And maybe also if you can address, what are the red lines that Greenland will not cross?
Well, that's a question to pose to the government of Greenland. I don't speak on behalf of the government of Greenland, but looking at the political history of Greenland, it's very clear that there's been a movement initiated by Naalakkersuisut, the government of Greenland itself, with decisions in the parliament to pursue further diversification of the economy, of the business sectors, increasing activities around mining and minerals and energy sector, increasing activities around the tourism sector, which is also the reason why the new airports were expanded, and simply diversifying the economy to build on more legs than just the fisheries, which has for a long time made up more than 95% of the export. So that's been a consensus policy of the parliament and government of Greenland. And we do have our own parliament and government, which has also been news to some in this massive media attention to our nation. And therefore, there's also been an effort to create new business relations and trade relations with different nations, including the US. And on top of that, exactly with the US, we can go back all the way to 1941, prior to the 1951 defense agreement, and also throughout the existence of the defense agreement, see that there's all the way through been a responsiveness and a clear understanding of what access does the US actually have to engaging with Geopolitics in terms of military presence. And therefore, parliaments and governments, changing parliaments and governments, have also put words and efforts into creating a more sort of clear communication towards the US of what the expectations would be, for example, in terms of business cooperation. And in the latest round, we've seen two memoranda of understanding signed between Greenland and the US in 2019 on business cooperation and other kinds of cooperation, knowledge production, and so forth, on energy and minerals. And also in 2020, a set of agreements that really also, again, cemented the interest from Geopolitics to engage with the US also in questions of security and military presence. So the open door that was mentioned, yes, I can verify that's been the political position. And of course, there are negotiations going on right now, and it's been important to respond to the very sort of diffuse communication going on social media by demanding, as I see it from the government of Greenland, that they have been demanding a diplomatic track to be initiated. And that is now underway and it's ongoing. And we have yet to see where that will take us.
Thank you. I would like to bring all three of you together. Feel free to chime in with your answers and just join in a robust conversation. We have a lot of interest, I think, in NATO and how this relationship is going to progress, given the tension that we've seen in the past couple of months regarding Greenland. My question is, having one NATO ally openly threaten to acquire the territory of another NATO ally is unprecedented in the history of NATO. Can NATO withstand this kind of internal shock? And what does it mean for the democratic world more largely when these basic principles that we know to rely on sovereignty, non-coercion, are tested in this way? Can it survive this?
So I'm happy to chime in. Yes, I mean, I believe NATO will survive this. In fact, today it was just announced that NATO military planners are now planning for what they're calling Arctic Sentry, which is an enhanced surveillance, strengthening Arctic security, which of course is what the president has been saying that he's seeking, Greenland is so important for international security and world security and very concerned about Russia and China. Well, we want our European NATO partners to increase their security. And last year, the Kingdom of Denmark put forward two very large new packages to increase Arctic security in and around Greenland. And we will see that unfold. So I think what NATO is doing is responding to increasing Arctic security. We'll see new missions. It will be predominantly European NATO members, which I think is very, very positive. What we have to see is in this bilateral track, if the United States is going to ask for, the opening of new military bases or something more. They have never articulated that. But NATO will get through this. But just to your point, something profoundly shifted over this. And, in part, we're increasing Arctic security, but, in the back of others' minds, this presence, this enhanced NATO presence is also keeping a watchful eye on the United States. And that is just something that I never thought I would articulate professionally.
Yeah, I think it's a great point too to note that, the Kingdom of Denmark spent in the billions last year, or committed in the billions last year to secure its Arctic footprint, to facilitate a greater presence on Greenland. And I'm not also convinced that NATO is really under threat. We saw with the accession of Sweden and Finland to the treaty organization, this more concerted effort to focus on the Arctic, and it put together these two puzzle pieces that were before then absent from all military planning, all NATO military planning documents for the European Arctic. So to see those countries come together and realize that on their own is, I think, beneficial to the entire Western Alliance. And even back in 2023, when I was with the Swedish Armed Forces, and I mentioned this in the book as well, that Secretary of State Blinken had signed a defense cooperation agreement. And even at that time, the soldiers and the NCOs there were sort of leery about it and felt like it was paying lip service because of the tumultuous times in the U.S. and whether or not they could be there to facilitate the support and defense that they had promised. So even dating back to 2022, 23, the European Arctic was keenly aware of its need to secure its own territory without the assistance of the U.S.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in. I'd like to take a couple of those if we can. Linda is asking, historically, Native peoples have been left behind economically. Do the changes in the Arctic offer positive economic opportunities for these people? And are they positioned to take advantage of economic opportunities? So Sarah, I may have you dive in on that if you can. Are the changes you're seeing, are there opportunities, economic opportunities for the indigenous population?
Well, there's always been lots of economic opportunities in the Arctic, and based on the different self-government arrangements that Inuit and other indigenous peoples of the Arctic have across the Arctic, not only in Greenland, but also in Canada and Alaska. especially Inuit, have pursued responsible resource development for decades and decades. And for the government in Galashinunaat, Greenland, it's been, especially since the introduction of the self-government in 2009, the first area to take responsibility of, which was still with Denmark at the time, even though since 1979 there had already been a self-government arrangement, a different kind of arrangement, the home rule government. So 2010 was with the first legislative area that was taken over under the self-government agreement was the whole area of mineral resource development. And so there's always been a very, very clear desire from indigenous peoples, especially Inuit in the Arctic, to be self-determining on development, prioritizing what kinds of development, prioritizing what to mine and what not to mine. And that authority today lies entirely and 100% with the Parliament and government of Greenland in the arrangement with Denmark. And therefore, I think that of course, there's an increased attention in this moment. But prior to that increase in the attention, there was already efforts to keep that dialogue and also message very clearly, as I said, both to the US and to the EU and to others, this openness to business. And there's also been a very clear understanding that there was an increasing great power rivalry on the go, and therefore also ways to navigate that in terms of possible Chinese interest that we've seen in the past. But we have seen a very clear, some would call it, and colleagues in Denmark would call it, a tactical retreat from the Chinese in terms of being present in Galashinunaat, be it either in terms of interest in investments in minerals or other kinds of presence on the business area and so forth, and research and tourism. But I think that you also have to remember that the Arctic Cooperation, as we know it, has been through many kinds of fluctuations over time, and we as indigenous peoples have been there through that. We predate the states and the concept of states, and so we've seen those fluctual changes, and they've been a precondition since states became into being, and those rivalries that have been there in the past, for example, during the Cold War, were also a precondition based on which the policies and rooms for maneuvering of indigenous peoples were formed in terms of politics. But we are at a different place now in history in comparison to the years after the Second World War, where the world agreed to institutionalize many things to ensure that we would have a democratic and peaceful cooperation also in the Arctic. And therefore, what we're seeing now also needs to be responded to in a way that builds on what has been built and not tearing it down.
Thank you, Sarah. We have a question from Cynthia. It says, there has been speculation that Russia may be behind or involved in some of the Trump administration's demands about Greenland. Does any of the panelists see any possibility of that? Any evidence, really?
Well, I think oh, sorry, Ken, go ahead.
Thanks, Heather. No, I think that, and Heather touched on this earlier, that President Putin and the Kremlin are extremely ecstatic by the rhetoric coming out of Washington, and this notion that they would continue to introduce militarization, taking and purchasing another country as validation of their own expansionist ideas. I wanted to Heather can touch on this more, but I wanted to also note what Sarah had said about an opportunity that has really arisen. And I was somewhat dismissive and upset when all the conversation about Greenland turned to militarization and the purchasing of it and sovereignty and control over it, because there had been this long discussion of self-determination and independence seeking, and that was no longer being discussed. But I think if the Greenlandic people can really turn this in their favor and say, well, now we have a bargaining chip because we're so desired, and we can have more allies who are expressing their stance with us, I think that could be beneficial and actually change the conversation. In the book, I mentioned a lot of times there were parts of the dialogue that were taking place without the indigenous people, and this might spur more of their involvement.
Thank you, Heather. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, if the best we can do is trace how the president, got this idea about Greenland, we traced it back to his college buddy Ron Lauder in 2019, and I honestly think it just was a conversation that the president then took and has been very focused on it. I don't foresee that there was any Russian deviousness underneath this. I think this was an idea that was implanted in the president, and he just continues to pursue that. I would also say, just on the conversation of the economic opportunity, I mean, I think there is important opportunities as there's increased access to the Arctic. When you think about infrastructure, if you're building infrastructure to help build a runway or to build a forward operating station for military forces, you're building roads to help a community. And I think the more that with the communities, support, that what we want to do is a lot of dual use infrastructure and support, so we can, continue to help the people who live in the North to be able to benefit if they so desire. So I think there's some win-win outcomes, but it has to be managed well. And again, to Sarah's point, the door has been open for the United States to do much more investment in Greenland. Just U.S. companies haven't necessarily walked through that door. A few have, mostly, they've been more Canadian, British, others. I don't know what is preventing them, their own sake, to do more, but it's always been available to them. And, hopefully we'll get in a better track where there'll be more meaningful investment across the circumpolar Arctic to help these populations navigate a very challenging, transformative moment for them.
Thanks to
Or
those of you
you
who
could
have
turn
been.
it around and say the Arctic peoples helping the interests of the states, because that's also what we've seen in Geopolitics, that decisions have been taken in our own parliament, for example, on expanding in critical infrastructure, which then also have affected both the security and military policies of the whole kingdom. So that's also my point in saying that we have a different, reality now in terms of governance in the Arctic in comparison to decades ago, where decisions are taken and they have implications. And that might also be a part of the explanation of what we're seeing today. That there are decisions taken, but in a sort of a construct that can be difficult to understand, and therefore also maybe poses the question of who controls what. So when Greenland chooses to build an airport or chooses to open a mine, who will then ensure that this happens in a way that is security-wise, in a way that they would want to see it from the US, and that sort of quarrel between Greenland and Denmark on who then does exactly what has been a quite open quarrel, and therefore, and to some extent, do it understand when some people have been questioning, exactly who controls what, and how do you really understand this Kingdom of Denmark construct? But for us who live in it, it's pretty clear. And it's also something, when you've been a parliamentarian in Geopolitics, it really does feel like you have taken, the parliament takes decisions, and then sometimes those decisions affects things the other way. So we are not just the receiving end, but we also, taking part in forming the Arctic.
There is an element that keeps percolating just below the surface, and that is the element of the constituents of these various countries. And just to, remind us all that these are, by and large, different types of democracies, right? And so my question is, what role do the people on the ground, do the voters play in determining the policy as we go forward, both in the short term and in the long term in NATO countries?
Well, I mean, the decision making, just to give two examples, and Sarah would welcome your thoughts on this. So the entity called the Arctic Council. So this is a consensus-based organization that brings the 8 Arctic nations together, and you listed them. But at the table are the permanent participants. These are the indigenous communities represented across the circumpolar Arctic, and it's a very unique organization because of that feature. And I think it's it's important that we continue to maintain that strong voice. But at least, obviously Russia, we're going to set aside for a second. In NATO, the people elect the governments and their forward-leaning policies, and that is how they determine. So if you think about the United States, Alaska has a very different approach as to development and the state policies and how the federal government supports or doesn't support. So, and it's very different in Norway. It's, different in Finland and elsewhere. But I think all of those democratically elected countries continue to try to send support, material support for their populations. In Russia, it's a forced development model because it has great parallels to Stalin's building of what he called the Red Arctic. It's really sort of forcing that great development without necessarily all the gulag, building and support. It's a very different model. So, as I said, I don't think this is about getting the balance right and making sure that we have security and prosperity for the populations that live in the North.
We have a question. Someone is asking, what led to the U.S. pulling out of Greenland? The questioner is saying that they understand there was more of a presence in earlier years. Kenneth, Heather, Sarah, any of you, maybe not pulling out, but scaling back in some ways. Can you answer that?
Well, first of all, of course, the end of the Cold War. I grew up just north of one of the dew line die stations, actually die 1. There was 4 of those over the dew line, the distant early warning line. And we were watching in the beginning of the 90s smoke coming up of the station as they were burning down some of the stuff. And we all, took a trip up to see, a lot of us, to see that abandoned dew line station, die 1 on Qaqqatuqaq, just south of the town Sisimiut. And so I think that was, a very significant change, the end of the Cold War in the military presence of the US. But again, a very important point that this was, of course, a self-determined action by the US to leave behind numerous stations and also equipment and so forth. And we have also concerns on the environmental impacts of that all across Galashitinat, Greenland. But there's been fluctuations in that since the 50s, but the Pituffik space base is still there, and that's been also a very central key element in the negotiations and the dialogue between Greenland and the US and Denmark as well, how to expand the collaboration based on the US military presence at the Pituffik space base.
Yeah, the American military presence was drawn down in part out of pragmatism, right? The Cold War ended, but also technology advanced. And what we needed to station on Greenland back then is not what we needed now. I mean, the weather stations that served the U.S. military and the Allied forces were in support of I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with this, but an invasion of France. We don't need that anymore with satellites and with the Pituffik space base. The equipment there is certainly dated, and the airfield certainly needs repair. And more attention could be just placed on the cooperation with the indigenous people of Greenland for as Sarah noted, some of the ecological issues that have occurred from the American presence. But what we have now is sufficient for most things when it comes to a security standpoint.
We have a question from the audience asking about whether NATO and Europe have the ability to stand up to President Trump, especially given that the US already has permission to make military maneuvers in Greenland. So really talking about leverage, does NATO and the US, does NATO and Europe have enough leverage to really push back to continue to do this?
So I would say we saw a very different posture by our European NATO allies. Sarah was absolutely right. I mean, this was, they went too far. The United States went too far. And, the fact that 8 NATO members deployed a very small number of forces to prepare for a future exercise in Greenland, that's what evidently provoked the president to threaten to put 10% of tariffs on those 8 nations. He saw that, I think, or interpreted that as denying him what he wanted. But you heard it very clearly that sovereignty, territorial integrity is not a negotiation. They stood very firm with that. And I think the president almost was surprised by that strength. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte at Davos sort of created an off-ramp when the president was, sort of back into a more constructive framework. But as I said, it did shake the foundations. What we will see, as we noted, I think, is just more European NATO members that will be more actively participating and exercising on Greenland. This is great. As Ken said, we need cold weather training. We have, just as we lost the bases and the military installations on Greenland because at the end of the Cold War, we've lost, our deep knowledge on cold weather fighting. We don't have ice strengthened hulls. I mean, the United States, looks to our allies to help us build icebreakers and to help us relearn how to fight in cold weather. So we're going to be leaning on our friends. I remember Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, as she was meeting with British Prime Minister Starmer right after sort of the whole drama of Davos. She wrote in the guest book, thanks from a little help from our friends. And I thought, the Beatles hit. I thought that was lovely. But the United States needs a little help from our Arctic allies to help us be able to better protect the United States and our allies in the Arctic. And the Norwegian Prime Minister just said, I think at Tromsø, Sarah, at the Arctic frontiers, that hey, the Russian nuclear missiles that are they're pointed at the United States, and Norway helps to detect early warning of those and helps make sure that the front line of defense is secure. So we really do need our allies to help protect the United States in the Arctic.
In Russia, there has been some rhetoric questioning the legitimacy of the Alaska purchase. How does the U.S. strategic interest in Greenland affect the balance of power in the Arctic in terms of Alaska?
Well, I'll just say one thing, and then I'm going to be quiet because I'm talking too much. What I loved is the Russian President Putin's spokesperson, as they were preparing for the Anchorage summit between President Trump and Putin. You know what they called Alaska? They called it Russia America. And they suggested that, my goodness, the strong ties, the Russian Orthodox Church and the old believers, that the heritage of when the United States purchased Alaska in 1867 from the Russian Empire, that, this purchase thing, maybe we'll want it back someday. And I remind colleagues that you start opening that door. And this is something that is not very helpful whatsoever, but ultra-Russian nationalists certainly say that Alaska was stolen from them. They want it back. Now, that's rhetoric, but yes, you start this rolling and you open up Pandora's box. Sorry, Ken, over to you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, you used the former name of Alaska, Russian America. And even during the Cold War, there were discussions about opening up this peace tunnel that would connect the Chukotka region to Alaska as a form of, a fig leaf, an olive branch of sorts. But it's right. I mean, the things that have come out of the White House in January really threatened to undermine so many things that were present in the Arctic previously. And I feel as though the messaging is going to be more indicative of how we saw the Trump administration respond to the tariffs with China, insofar as saying, look at what we got out of this deal. We can expand our military bases and our access to rare earth minerals, when in fact we already had it. And the administration gets to chalk it up to a win, when in fact it was there all along.
So I want to also ask, back to the changing environment that we're seeing, as the ice melts, new opportunities are arising for mining, especially for rare earth minerals. The question is, can the Arctic pursue development without sacrificing either the environment or the cultural continuity of the Inuit communities? And Sarah, I want to ask you if you could kick that off for us.
Well, mining has existed in the Arctic for more than 100 years, and the difference is now that especially a lot of the Inuit communities and Inuit nations, we are self-determining on whether to mine or not. Let's take the cryolite as an example. The cryolite mine existed for more than 100 years. It was an extremely important source of cryolite to produce aluminum during the Second World War, so that the Western Alliance could produce their airplanes and win the war. But none of the income from the cryolite benefited Galashiq Greenlanders or Inuit. And so learning from those things in history, mining is a fact. It's happening. There's a self-determination in Greenland on what to mine and what not to mine. But there's also a long history of doing mining. So it's not a new thing that only comes with climate change. And I think that's important to remember. We are often seeing these very sort of dramatized narratives about things opening up in the Arctic. Climate change is deeply, deeply affecting us. It's also affecting Inuit in Alaska, where we saw in the western Alaskan coast relocation of 1,000 inhabitants in combination, 2 towns fully relocated because their towns were flooded due to the typhoon Halong, in combination with extreme weather hitting the melting permafrost on the ground beneath the towns. And now they can no longer return as it looks right now. So I think climate change is a very serious issue that is not just about opening up for economic opportunities or for us. It's a serious issue that is really, really the biggest security risk as we see it right now in terms of our cultural well-being and well-being as peoples in general. So I think there's an importance in trying to also carefully think about those narratives and then maybe also understanding the history of economic development in the Arctic, also the economic development that we as Arctic peoples have pursued ourselves.
I think there's 2 parts of the economic question or debate that comes up, and that's the maritime traffic and then also the rare earth minerals and the extractive industries. And while it's true that the extractive industries have lasted for hundreds of years, 100 years and counting, we also are seeing greater traffic coming through the Bering Strait. It increased 8-fold over the last 2 years. So that is a real reality that has changed drastically over the last 5-10 years, having more ships, having more people navigating these waters that were otherwise icebound for much of the year. So that is what I'm watching more closely to see whether or not there will be issues with increased traffic. But the extractive industries are certainly enticing, but oftentimes get mixed up in the discussion of economic prosperity.
I want to thank all of you for our panel this evening. This has been a great discussion. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you, Sarah Olsvig, Kenneth Rosen, and Heather Conley for your clarity, for your insight. And thanks to our audience for joining us for this important conversation this evening. This program is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, and the Mass Cultural Council. If you enjoy Cambridge Forum's programs, please consider making a donation at cambridgeforum.org. Thank you again for being with us, and good night.